This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Superstition of Divorce by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 1 with Introductory Note. The earliest part of this book appeared in the form of 5 articles, which came out in the New Witness at the crisis of the recent controversy in the press on the subject of divorce. Crude and sketchy as they confessedly were, they had a certain rude plan of their own, which I find very difficult to recast even in order to expand. I have therefore decided to reprint the original articles as they stood, save for a few introductory words, and then, at the risk of repetition, to add a few further chapters, explaining more fully any conceptions that may seem to have been too crudely assumed or dismissed. I have set forth the original matter as it appeared under a general heading, without dividing it into chapters. G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 1. The Superstition of Divorce. It is futile to talk of reform without reference to form. To take a case from my own tastes and fancy, there is nothing I feel to be so beautiful and wonderful as a window. All casements are magic casements, whether they open on the foam or the front garden. They lie close to the ultimate mystery and paradox of limitation and liberty. But if I followed my instincts toward an infinite number of windows, it would end in having no walls. It would also, it may be added incidentally, end in having no windows either, for a window makes a picture by making a picture frame. But there is a simpler way of stating my more simple and fatal error. It is that I have wanted a window without considering whether I wanted a house. Now many appeals are being made to us today on behalf of that light and liberty that might well be symbolized by windows, especially as so many of them concern the enlightenment and liberation of the house in the sense of the home. Many quite disinterested people urge many quite reasonable considerations in the case of divorce, as a type of domestic liberation. But in the journalistic and general discussion of the matter, there is far too much of the mind that works backwards and at random, in the manner of all windows and no walls. Such people say they want divorce without asking themselves whether they want marriage. Even in order to be divorced, it has generally been found necessary to go through the preliminary formality of being married, and unless the nature of this initial act be considered, we might as well be considering hair-cutting for the bald or spectacles for the blind. To be divorced is to be in the literal sense unmarried, and there is no sense in a thing being undone when we do not know if it is done. There is perhaps no worse advice, 9 times out of 10, than the advice to do the work that's nearest. It is especially bad when it means, as it generally does, removing the obstacle that's nearest. It means that men are not to behave like men, but like mice, who nibble at the thing that's nearest. The man, like the mouse, undermines what he cannot understand. Because he himself bumps into a thing, he calls it the nearest obstacle, though the obstacle may happen to be the pillar that holds up the whole roof over his head. He industriously removes the obstacle, and in return the obstacle removes him, and much more valuable things than he. This opportunism is perhaps the most unpractical thing in this highly unpractical world. People talk vaguely against destructive criticism, but what is the matter with this criticism is not that it destroys, but that it does not criticize. It is destruction without design. It is taking a complex machine to pieces bit by bit in any order without even knowing what the machine is for. And if a man deals with a deadly dynamic machine on the principle of touching the knob that's nearest, he will find out the defects of that cheery philosophy. Now, leaving many sincere and serious critics of modern marriage on one side for the moment, great masses of modern men and women who write and talk about marriage are thus nibbling blindly at it like an army of mice. When the reformers propose, for instance, that divorce should be obtainable after an absence of 3 years, the absence actually taken for granted in the first military arrangements of the late European war, their readers and supporters could seldom give any sort of logical reason for the period being 3 years and not 3 months or 3 minutes. They are like people who should say, "Give me 3 feet of dog," and not care where the cut came. Such persons fail to see a dog as an organic entity. In other words, they cannot make head or tail of it. And the chief thing to say about such reformers of marriage is that they cannot make head or tail of it. They do not know what it is, or what it is meant to be, or what its supporters suppose it to be. They never look at it, even when they are inside it. They do the work that's nearest, which is poking holes in the bottom of a boat under the impression that they are digging in a garden. This question of what a thing is and whether it is a garden or a boat appears to them abstract and academic. They have no notion of how large is the idea they attack, or how relatively small appear the holes that they pick in it. Thus Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, an intelligent man in other matters, says that there is only a theological opposition to divorce, and that it is entirely founded on certain texts in the Bible about marriages. This is exactly as if he had said that a belief in the brotherhood of men was only founded on certain texts in the Bible about all men being the children of Adam and Eve. Millions of peasants and plain people all over the world assume marriage to be static, without having ever clapped eyes on any text. Numbers of more modern people, especially after the recent experiments in America, think divorce is a social disease, without having ever bothered about any text. It may be maintained that even in these, or in any one, the idea of marriage is ultimately mystical, and the same may be maintained about the idea of brotherhood. It is obvious that a husband and wife are not visibly one flesh, in the sense of being one quadruped. It is equally obvious that Paderewski and Jack Johnson are not twins, and probably have not played together at their mother's knee. There is indeed a very important admission or addition to be realized here. What is true is this, that if the nonsense of Nietzsche or some such sophist submerged current culture so that it was the fashion to deny the duties of fraternity, then indeed it might be found that the group which still affirmed fraternity was the original group in whose sacred books was the text about Adam and Eve. Suppose some Prussian professor has opportunely discovered that Germans and lesser men are respectively descended from 2 such very different monkeys that they are in no sense brothers, but barely cousins, German, any number of times removed. And suppose he proceeds to remove them even further with a hatchet. Suppose he bases on this a repetition of the conduct of Cain, saying, not so much "I am my brother's keeper" as "Is he really my brother?" And suppose this higher philosophy of the hatchet becomes prevalent in colleges and cultivated circles, as even more foolish philosophies have done. Then I agree it probably will be the Christian, the man who preserves the text about Cain, who will continue to assert that he is still the professor's brother, and that he is still the professor's keeper. He may possibly add that, in his opinion, the professor seems to require a keeper. And that is doubtless the situation in the controversies about divorce and marriage today. It is the Christian Church which continues to hold strongly, when the world for some reason has weakened on it, what many others hold at other times. But even then it is barely picking up the shreds and scraps of the subject to talk about a reliance on texts. The vital point in the comparison is this, that human brotherhood means a whole view of life, held in the light of life, and defended, rightly or wrongly, by constant appeals to every aspect of life. The religion that holds it most strongly will hold it when nobody else holds it. That is quite true, and that some of us may be so perverse as to think a point in favour of the religion. But anybody who holds it at all will hold it as a philosophy, not hung on one text, but on 100 truths. Fraternity may be a sentimental metaphor. I may be suffering a delusion when I hail a Montenegrin peasant as my long-lost brother. As a fact, I have my own suspicion about which of us is that got lost. But my delusion is not a deduction from one text or from 20. It is the expression of a relation that to me at least seems a reality. And what I should say about the idea of a brother, I should say about the idea of a wife. It is supposed to be very unbusinesslike to begin at the beginning. It is called abstract and academic. Principles with which English, etc., etc. It is still in some strange way considered unpractical to open up inquiries about anything by asking what it is. I happen to have, however, a fairly complete contempt for that sort of practicality, for I know that it is not even practical. My ideal business man would not be one who planked down £50 and said, "Here's hard cash. I am a plain man, but it is quite indifferent to me whether I am paying a debt or giving alms to a beggar or buying a wild bull or a bathing machine." Despite the infectious heartiness of his tone, I should still, in considering the hard cash, say, like a cabman, "What's this?" I should continue to insist priggishly that it was a highly practical point what the money was, what it was supposed to stand for, to aim at or declare. What was the nature of the transaction? Or, in short, what the devil is the man supposed he was doing? I shall therefore begin by asking, in an equally mystical manner, what, in the name of God and the angels, a man getting married supposes he is doing. I shall begin by asking what marriage is, and the mere question will probably reveal that the act itself, good or bad, wise or foolish, is of a certain kind, that it is not an inquiry or an experiment or an accident. It may probably dawn on us that it is a promise. It can be more fully defined by saying it is a vow. Many will immediately answer that it is a rash vow. I am content for the moment to reply that all vows are rash vows. I am not now defending, but defining vows. I am pointing out that this is a discussion about vows. First, of whether there ought to be vows, and second, of what vows ought to be. Ought a man to break a promise? Ought a man to make a promise? These are philosophical questions. But the philosophic peculiarity of divorce and remarriage, as compared with free love and no marriage, is that a man breaks and makes a promise at the same moment. It is a highly Germanic philosophy, and recalls the way in which the enemy wishes to celebrate his successful destruction of all treaties by signing some more. If I were breaking a promise, I would do it without promises. But I am very far from minimizing the momentous and disputable nature of the vow itself. I shall try to show in a further article that this rash and romantic operation is the only furnace from which can come the plain hardware of humanity, the cast-iron resistance of citizenship, or the cold steel of common sense. But I am not denying that the furnace is afire. The vow is a violent and unique thing, though there have been many besides the marriage vow, vows of chivalry, vows of poverty, vows of celibacy, pagan as well as Christian. But modern fashion has rather fallen out of the habit, and men miss the type for the lack of the parallels. The shortest way of putting the problem is to ask whether being free includes being free to bind oneself, for the vow is a tryst with oneself. I may be misunderstood if I say, for brevity, that marriage is an affair of honour. The sceptic will be delighted to assent by saying it is a fight, and so it is, if only with oneself. But the point here is that it necessarily has the touch of the heroic, in which virtue can be translated by virtus. Now, about fighting in nature there is an implied infinity, or at least potential infinity. I mean that loyalty in war is loyalty in defeat or even disgrace. It is due to the flag precisely at the moment when the flag nearly falls. We do already apply this to the flag of the nation, and the question is whether it is wise or unwise to apply it to the flag of the family. Of course, it is tenable that we should apply it to neither, that misgovernment in the nation or misery in the citizen would make the desertion of the flag an act of reason and not treason. I will only say here that if this were really the limit of national loyalty, some of us would have deserted our nation long ago. End of chapter 1. This is a LibriVox recording, and all LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Superstition of Divorce by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 2. The Superstition of Divorce 2. To the 2 or 3 articles appearing here on this subject, I have given the title of The Superstition of Divorce, and the title is not taken at random. While free love seems to me a heresy, divorce does really seem to me a superstition. It is not only more of a superstition than free love, but much more of a superstition than strict sacramental marriage, and this point can hardly be made too plain. It is the partisans of divorce, not the defenders of marriage, who attach a stiff and senseless sanctity to a mere ceremony, apart from the meaning of the ceremony. It is our opponents, and not we, who hope to be saved by the letter of ritual instead of the spirit of reality. It is they who hold that vow or violation, loyalty or disloyalty, can all be disposed of by a mysterious and magic rite performed first in a law court and then in a church or registry office. There is little difference between the two parts of the ritual, except that the law court is much more ritualistic. But the plainest parallels will show anybody that all this is sheer barbarous credulity. It may or may not be superstition for a man to believe he must kiss the Bible to show he is telling the truth. It is certainly the most grovelling superstition for him to believe that if he kisses the Bible anything he says will come true. It would surely be the blackest and most benighted Bible worship to suggest that the mere kiss on the mere book alters the moral quality of perjury. Yet this is precisely what is implied in saying that formal remarriage alters the moral quality of conjugal infidelity. It may have been a mark of the Dark Ages that Harold should swear on a relic, though he were afterwards forsworn. But surely those ages would have been at their darkest if he had been content to be sworn on a relic and forsworn on another relic. Yet this is the new altar those reformers would erect for us, out of the mouldy and meaningless relics of their dead laws and their dying religion. Now we, at any rate, are talking about an idea, a thing of the intellect and the soul, which we feel to be unalterable by legal antics. We are talking about the idea of loyalty, perhaps a fantastic, perhaps only an unfashionable idea, but one we can explain and defend as an idea. Now I have already pointed out that most sane men do admit our ideal in such a case as patriotism or public spirit, the necessity of saving the state to which we belong. The patriot may revile, but must not renounce his country. He must curse it to cure it, but not to wither it up. The old pagan citizens felt thus about the city, and modern nationalists feel thus about the nation. But even mere modern internationalists feel it about something, if it is only the nation of mankind. Even the humanitarian does not become a misanthrope and live in a monkey house. Even a disappointed collectivist or communist does not retire into the exclusive society of beavers, because beavers are all communists of the most class-conscious solidarity. He admits the necessity of clinging to his fellow creatures and begging them to abandon the use of the possessive pronoun. heartbreaking as his efforts must seem to him after a time. Even a pacifist does not prefer rats to men, on the ground that the rat community is so pure from the taint of jingoism as always to leave the sinking ship. In short, everybody recognizes that there is some ship, large and small, which he ought not to leave, even when he thinks it is sinking. We may take it then that there are institutions to which we are attached finally, just as there are others to which we are attached temporarily. We go from shop to shop trying to get what we want, but we do not go from nation to nation doing this, unless we belong to a certain group now heading very straight for pogroms. In the first case it is the threat that we shall withdraw our custom. In the second it is the threat that we shall never withdraw ourselves, that we shall be part of the institution to the last. The time when the shop loses its customers is the time when the city needs its citizens, but it needs them as critics who will always remain to criticize. I need not now emphasize the deadly need of this double energy of internal reform and external defence. The whole towering tragedy which has eclipsed our earth in our time is but one terrific illustration of it. The hammer strokes are coming thick and fast now, and filling the world with infernal thunders, and there is still the iron sound of something unbreakable, deeper and louder than all the things that break. We may curse the kings, we may distrust the captains, we may murmur at the very existence of the armies, but we know that in the darkest days that may come to us, no man will desert the flag. Now when we pass from loyalty to the nation to loyalty to the family, there can be no doubt about the first and plainest difference. The difference is that the family is a thing far more free. The vow is a voluntary loyalty, and the marriage vow is marked among ordinary oaths of allegiance by the fact that the allegiance is also a choice. The man is not only a citizen of the city, but also the founder and builder of the city. He is not only a soldier serving the colours, but he has himself artistically selected and combined the colours, like the colours of an individual dress. If it be admissible to ask him to be true to the commonwealth that has made him, it is at least not more illiberal to ask him to be true to the commonwealth he himself has made. If civic fidelity be, as it is, a necessity, it is also, in a special sense, a constraint. The old joke against patriotism, the Gilbertian irony, congratulated the Englishman on his fine and fastidious taste in being born in England. It made a plausible point in saying, for he might have been a Russian, though indeed we have liked to see some persons who seemed to think that they could be Russians when the fancy took them. If common sense considers even such involuntary loyalty natural, we can hardly wonder if it thinks voluntary loyalty still more natural. And the small state founded on the sexes is at once the most voluntary and most natural of all self-governing states. It is not true of Mr. Brown that he might have been a Russian, but it may be true of Mrs. Brown that she might have been a Robinson. Now it is not at all hard to see why this small community, so specially free touching its cause, should yet be specially bound touching its effects. It is not hard to see why the vow made most freely is the vow kept most firmly. There are attached to it, by the nature of things, consequences so tremendous that no contract can offer any comparison. There is no contract, unless it be what is said to be signed in blood, that can call spirits from the vastly deep, or bring cherubs or goblins to inhabit a small modern villa. There is no stroke of the pen which creates real bodies and souls, or makes the characters in a novel come to life. The institution that puzzles intellectuals so much can be explained by the mere material fact, perceptible even to intellectuals, that children are, generally speaking, younger than their parents. "Till death do us part" is not an irrational formula, for those will almost certainly die before they see more than half of the amazing or alarming thing they have done. Such is, in a curt and crude outline, this obvious thing for those to whom it is not obvious. Now I know there are thinking men among those who would tamper with it, and I shall expect some of these to reply to my questions. But for the moment I only ask this question: whether the parliamentary and journalistic divorce movement shows even a shadowy trace of these fundamental truths regarded as tests. Does it even discuss the nature of a vow, the limits and objects of loyalty, the survival of the family as a small and free state? The writers are content to say that Mr. Brown is uncomfortable with Mrs. Brown, and the last emancipation for separated couples seems only to mean that he is still uncomfortable without Mrs. Brown. These are not days in which being uncomfortable is felt as the final test of public action. For the rest, the reformers show statistically that families are in fact so scattered in our industrial anarchy that they may as well abandon hope of finding their way home again. I am acquainted with that argument for making bad worse, and I see it everywhere leading to slavery. Because London Bridge is broken down, we must assume that bridges are not meant to bridge. Because London commercialism and capitalism have copied hell, we are to continue to copy them. Anyhow, some will retain the conviction that the ancient bridge built between the two towers of sex is the worthiest of the great works of the earth. It is exceedingly characteristic of the dreary decades before the war that the forms of freedom in which they seemed to specialize were suicide and divorce. I am not at the moment pronouncing on the moral problem of either. I am merely noting, as signs of those times, those two true or false counsels of despair, the end of life and the end of love. Other forms of freedom were being increasingly curtailed. Freedom, indeed, was the one thing that progressives and conservatives alike contemned. Socialists were largely concerned to prevent strikes by state arbitration, that is, by adding another rich man to give the casting vote between rich and poor. Even in claiming what they call the right to work, they tacitly surrender the right to leave off working. Tories were preaching conscription, not so much to defend the independence of England as to destroy the independence of Englishmen. Liberals, of course, were chiefly interested in eliminating liberty, especially touching beer and betting. It was wicked to fight, and unsafe even to argue, for citing any certain and contemporary fact might land one in a libel action. As all these doors were successfully shut in our faces along the chilly and cheerless corridor of progress with its glazed tiles, the doors of death and divorce alone stood open, or rather opened wider and wider. I do not expect the exponents of divorce to admit any similarity in the two things, yet the passing parallel is not irrelevant. It may enable them to realize the limits within which our moral instincts can, even for the sake of argument, treat this desperate remedy as a normal object of desire. Divorce is for us at best a failure, of which we are more concerned to find the cure and cause than to complete the effects. And we regard a system that produces many divorces as we do a system that drives men to drown and shoot themselves. For instance, it is perhaps the commonest complaint against the existing law that the poor cannot afford to avail themselves of it. It is an argument to which normally I should listen with special sympathy. But while I should condemn the law being a luxury, my first thought will naturally be that divorce and death are only luxuries in a rather rare sense. I should not primarily condole with the poor man on the high price of prussic acid, or on the fact that all precipices of suitable suicidal height were the private property of landlords. There are other high prices and high precipices I should attack first. I should admit in the abstract what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, that what is good for the rich is good for the poor. But my first and strongest impression would be that prussic acid sauce is not good for anybody. I fear I should, on the impulse of the moment, pull a clerk or an artisan back by the coat tails if he were jumping over Shakespeare's cliff, even if Dover sands were strewn with the remains of dukes and bankers who had already taken the plunge. But in one respect I will heartily concede the cult of divorce has differed from the mere cult of death. The cult of death is dead. Those I knew in my youth as young pessimists are now aged optimists. And what is more to the point at present, even when it was living it was limited. It was a thing of one clique in one class. We know the rule in the old comedy that when the heroine went mad in white satin, the confidant went mad in white muslin. But when in some tragedy of the artistic temperament the painter committed suicide in velvet, it was never implied that the plumber must commit suicide in corduroy. It was never held that Hedda Walter's housemaid must die in torment on the carpet, trying as her term of service may have been, or that Mr. Tanqueray's butler must play the Roman fool and die on his own carving knife. That particular form of playing the fool, Roman or otherwise, was an oligarchic privilege in the decadent epoch, and even as such largely passed with that epoch. Pessimism, which was never popular, is no longer even fashionable. A far different fate has awaited the other fashion, the other somewhat dismal form of freedom. If divorce is a disease, it is no longer to be a fashionable disease like appendicitis. It is to be made an epidemic like smallpox. As we have already seen, papers and public men today make a vast parade of the necessity of setting the poor man free to get a divorce. Now why are they so mortally anxious that he should be free to get a divorce, and not in the least anxious that he should be free to get anything else? Why are the same people happy, nay, almost hilarious, when he gets a divorce, who are horrified when he gets a drink? What becomes of his money? What becomes of his children? Where he works, when he ceases to work, are less and less under his personal control. Labour exchanges, insurance cards, welfare work, and 100 forms of police inspection and supervision have combined, for good or evil, to fix him more or more strictly to a certain place in society. He is less and less allowed to go look for a new job. Why is he allowed to go look for a new wife? He is more and more compelled to recognise a Moslem code about liquor. Why is it made so easy for him to escape from his old Christian code about sex? What is the meaning of this mysterious immunity, this special permit for adultery? And why is running away with his neighbour's wife to be the only exhilaration still left open to him? Why must he love as he pleases when he may not even live as he pleases? The answer is, I regret to say, that this social campaign in most, though by no means all, of its most prominent campaigners relies in this matter on a very smug and pestilent piece of chalk. There are some advocates of democratic divorce who are really advocates of general democratic freedom, but they are the exceptions. I might say, with all respect, that they are the dupes. The omnipresence of the thing in the press and the political society is due to a motive precisely opposite to the motive professed. The modern rulers, who are simply the rich men, are really quite consistent in their attitude to the poor man. It is the same spirit which takes away his children under the pretence of order, which takes away his wife under the pretence of liberty. That which wishes, in the words of the comic song, to break up the happy home is primarily anxious not to break up the much more unhappy factory. Capitalism, of course, is at war with the family, for the same reason which has led its being at war with the trade union. This, indeed, is the only sense in which it is true that capitalism is connected with individualism. Capitalism believes in collectivism for itself and individualism for its enemies. It desires its victims to be individuals, or in other words, to be atoms, for the word atom in its clearest meaning, which is none too clear, might be translated as individual. If there be any bond, if there be any brotherhood, if there be any class loyalty or domestic discipline by which the poor can help the poor, these emancipators will certainly strive to loosen that bond or lift that discipline in the most liberal fashion. If there be such a brotherhood, these individualists will redistribute it in the form of individuals, or in other words, smash it to atoms. The masters of modern plutocracy know what they are about. They are making no mistake. They can be cleared of the slander of inconsistency. A very profound and precise instinct has led them to single out the human household as the chief obstacle to their inhuman progress. Without the family we are helpless before the state, which in our modern case is the servile state. To use a military metaphor, the family is the only formation in which the charge of the rich can be repulsed. It is a force that forms twos as soldiers form fours, and in every peasant country has stood in the square house or the square plot of land as infantry have stood in squares against cavalry. How this force operates this, and why, I'll try to explain in the last of these articles, but it is when it is most nearly ridden down by the horsemen of pride and privilege, as in Poland or Ireland, when the battle grows most desperate and the hope most dark, that men begin to understand why that wild oath in its beginnings was flung beyond the bonds of the world, and what would seem as passing as a vision is made permanent as a vow. End of chapter 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Superstition of Divorce by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 3. The Superstition of Divorce 3. There has long been a curiously consistent attempt to conceal the fact that France is a Christian country. There have been Frenchmen in the plot, no doubt, and no doubt there have been Frenchmen, though I have myself only found Englishmen, in the derivative attempt to conceal the fact that Balzac was a Christian writer. I began to read Balzac long after I read The Admirers of Balzac, and they had never given me a hint of this truth. I had read that his books were bound in yellow and quite impudently French, though I may have been cloudy about why being French should be impudent in a Frenchman. I had read the truer description of the grimy wizard of the Comedy Humaine, and have lived to learn the truth of it. Balzac certainly is a genius, of the type of that artist he himself describes, who could draw a broomstick so that one knew it had swept the room after a murderer. The furniture of Balzac is more alive than the figures of many dramas. For this I was prepared, but not for a certain spiritual assumption which I regarded at once as a historical phenomena. The morality of a great writer is not the morality he teaches, but the morality he takes for granted. The Catholic type of Christian ethic runs through Balzac's book exactly as the Puritan type of Christian ethic runs through Bunyan's books. What his professed opinions were I do not know, any more than I know Shakespeare's. But I know that both those great creators of a multitudinous world made it, as compared with other and later writers, on the same fundamental moral plan as the universe of Dante. There can be no doubt about it, for any one who can apply as a test the truth I have mentioned, that the fundamental things in a man are not the things he explains, but rather the things he forgets to explain. But here and there Balzac does explain, and with that intellectual concentration Mr. George Moore has acutely observed in that novelist when he is a theorist. And the other day I found in one of Balzac's novels this passage, which, whether or no it would precisely hit Mr. George Moore's mood at the moment, strikes me as a perfect prophecy of this epoch, and might also be a motto for this book. With the solidarity of the family, society has lost that elemental force which Montesquieu defined and called honour. Society has isolated its members the better to govern them, and has divided in order to weaken. Throughout our youth and the years before the war, the current criticism followed Ibsen in describing the domestic system as a doll's house and the domestic woman as a doll. Mr. Bernard Shaw varied the metaphor by saying that the mere custom kept the woman in the home as it keeps the parrot in the cage, and the plays and tales of the period made vivid sketches of a woman who also resembled a parrot in other particulars, rich in raiment, shrill in accent, and addicted to saying over and over again what she had been taught to say. Mr. Granville Barker, the spiritual child of Mr. Bernard Shaw, commented in his clever play of The Voysey Inheritance on tyranny, hypocrisy, and boredom as the constituent elements of a happy English home. Leaving the truth of this aside for the moment, it will be well to insist that the conventionality thus criticised would be even more characteristic of a happy French home. It is not the Englishman's house, but the Frenchman's house, that is his castle. It might be further added, touching the essential ethical view of the sexes at least, that the Irishman's house is his castle, though it has been for some centuries a besieged castle. Anyhow, those conventions which were remarked as making domesticity dull, narrow, and unnaturally meek and submissive are particularly powerful among the Irish and the French. From this it will surely be easy for any lucid and logical thinker to deduce the fact that the French are dull and narrow, and that the Irish are unnaturally meek and submissive. Mr. Bernard Shaw, being an Irishman who lives among Englishmen, may be conveniently taken as the type of the difference, and it will no doubt be found that the political friends of Mr. Shaw, among Englishmen, will be of a wilder revolutionary type than those whom he would have found among Irishmen. We are in a position to compare the meekness of the Fenians with the fury of the Fabians. This deadening monogamic ideal may, even in a larger sense, define and distinguish all the flat subserviency of Clare from all the flaming revolt of Clapham. Nor need we now look far to understand why revolutions have been unknown in the history of France, or why they happen so persistently in the vaguer politics of England. This rigidity and respectability must surely be the explanation of all that incapacity for any civil experiment or explosion which has always marked that sleepy hamlet of very private houses which we call the city of Paris. But the same things are true not only of Parisians but of peasants. They are even true of other peasants in the Great Alliance. Students of Serbian traditions tell us that the peasant literature lays a special and singular curse on the violation of marriage, and this well may explain the prim and sheepish pacifism complained of in that people. In plain words, there is clearly something wrong in the calculation by which it was proved that a housewife must be as much a servant as a housemaid, or which exhibited the domesticated man as being as gentle as the primrose or as conservative as the Primrose League. It is precisely those who have been conservative about the family who have been revolutionary about the state. Those who are blamed for the bigotry or bourgeois smugness of their marriage conventions are actually those blamed for the restlessness and violence of their political reforms. Now, is there seriously any difficulty in discovering the cause of this? It is simply that in such a society the government, in dealing with the family, deals with something almost as permanent and self-renewing as itself. There can be a continuous family policy, like a continuous foreign policy. In peasant countries the family fights. It may almost be said that the farm fights. I do not mean merely that it riots in evil and exceptional times, though this is not unimportant. It was a savage but a sane feature when in the Irish evictions the women poured hot water from the windows. It was a part of that final falling back on private tools as public weapons. That sort of thing is not only war to the knife, but almost war to the fork and spoon. It was in this grim sense, perhaps, that Parnell, in that mysterious pun, said that kettle was a household word in Ireland. It certainly ought to be after its subsequent glories. And in a more general sense, it is certain that meddling with the housewife will ultimately mean getting into hot water. But it is not of such crises of bodily struggle that I speak, but of a steady and peaceful pressure from below of 1,000 families upon the framework of government. For this a certain spirit of defence and enclosure is essential, and even feudalism was right in feeling that any such affair of honour must be a family affair. It was a true artistic instinct that pictured the pedigree on the coat that protects the body. The free peasant has arms if he has not armorial bearings. He has not an escutcheon, but he has a shield. Nor do I see why, in a freer and happy society than the present, or even the past, it should not be a blazoned shield. For that is true of pedigree which is true of property. The wrong is not in its being imposed on men, but rather in its being denied to them. Too much capitalism does not mean too many capitalists, but too few capitalists, and so aristocracy sins not in planting a family tree, but in not planting a family forest. Anyhow, it is found in practice that the domestic citizen can stand a siege, even by the State, because he has those who will stand by him through thick and thin, especially thin. Now those who hold that the State can be made fit to own all and administer all can consistently disregard this argument, but it may be said, with all respect, that the world is more and more disregarding them. If we could find a perfect machine and a perfect man to work it, it might be a good argument for State Socialism, though an equally good argument for personal despotism. But most of us, I fancy, are now agreed that something of that social pressure from below, which we call freedom, is vital to the health of the State, and this it is which cannot be fully exercised by individuals, but only by groups and traditions. Such groups have been many. There have been many monasteries. There may be guilds, but there is only one type among them which all human beings have a spontaneous and omnipresent inspiration to build for themselves, and this type is the family. I had intended this article to be the last of those outlining the elements of this debate, but I shall have to add a short concluding section on the way in which all this is missed in the practical, or rather unpractical, proposals about divorce. Here I will only say that they suffer from the modern and morbid weaknesses of always sacrificing the normal to the abnormal. As a fact, the tyranny, hypocrisy, boredom complained of are not domesticity, but the decay of domesticity. The case of that particular complaint in Mr. Granville Barker's play is itself a proof. The whole point of the Voysey inheritance was that there was no Voysey inheritance. The only heritage of that family was a highly dishonourable debt. Naturally, their family affections had decayed when their whole ideal of property and probity had decayed, and there was little love as well as little honour among thieves. It is yet to be proved that they would have been as much bored if they had had a positive and not a negative heritage, and had worked a farm instead of a fraud. And the experience of mankind points the other way. End of chapter 3.